Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for TCRP's debrief of the 89th Texas Legislature. If you could please introduce yourself in the chat by including your name, the city you're joining us from, your pronouns, and why you joined us today, we'd greatly appreciate it. We'd love to know who's in the room with us. I also wanted to let you know that we will be accepting Q&A through Zoom, and we'll circle back to those questions, time permitting, at the end. We at TCRP are so grateful to all of you for joining us today to debrief the 89th Texas legislative session. As an organization, this was our first session with a fully equipped policy and advocacy team with dedicated issue experts at the Ledge full time advocating on behalf of our Beyond Borders criminal legal and voting rights programs. There were some wins and some losses, but I'll let the team tell you more about those. I'm very excited to introduce first a very special guest. State Representative Ramon Romero Jr. is serving his sixth term representing House District 90 in Fort Worth, Texas. He also serves as chair of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus for the 89th Texas Legislative Session and sits on the House committees on calendars, natural resources, and licensing and administrative procedures. The proud son of Mexican immigrants, Representative Romero became the first Latino state representative from Tarrant County in 2014 after defeating an 18-year incumbent. A lifelong East Fort Worth resident, he has championed legislation on workforce development, mental health, criminal justice reform, and veterans issues throughout his career. Outside the Capitol, Representative Romero owns a small business and is a proud father and grandfather. His work reflects a lifelong commitment to community, resilience, and services. Without further ado, please welcome Representative Romero.
Thank you, Chris. Glad to be here with everyone. Much love to all of you and the incredible work that y'all do and how y'all made me look good this session. You could have left off the grandfather part, Chris. Everyone says you're too young to be a grandpa, but I'm very proud to be a grandfather of four, one of which just completed. My youngest grandson just had his third birthday this weekend. It's nice to finally be home, sleep in your own bed after a very long legislative session. Just to kind of hit on some of the points in the bio, I will say that this is the first session where I was ever really given a lot of responsibility in my committee assignments. Everyone knows we had a speaker's race, and we really worked really hard as Democrats this year to, as we would say, kind of to give them hell and not let them walk into having a speaker that could really get prepared before we came into session. And I think that one of the reasons for some of our success was the fact that, they didn't get to build up their team and their game plan before session came on. And Speaker Burrows didn't become speaker until, the last hour. But because of that, we ended up on calendars and calendars as MALC chair and a lot of the work that TCRP did and so many other groups came in to ensure to drop cards on bills allowed us to put it on our radar really early on and watch it and complain about it to the speaker and to the chairman of calendars to say, hold on, we don't need to hear this crap. We are not going to go there. What are these guys thinking? And because of the positions in those good quality committees, I was even able to go to a lot of the members and say, excuse my language, but this is a real BS bill. And we don't need to hear that. So we had a lot of success. But of course, we try to kill as many bills as we could, but a lot of them still got through. We saw a tremendous amount of anti-LGBTQ bills that got to the floor. We saw a tremendous amount of voting rights bills. We killed some of those as well. Um, we saw a lot of HJRs and SJRs, which we knew were attempts by the governor to go to the polls and tell people, it's your chance to make sure illegals don't vote. This is your chance to make sure we lock them up and throw away the key. And while those still passed, we know that people like you who are on the call are going to be those that are going to be fighting these bills in court. And it seems like that's our last line of defense given the current situation. And I'm no lawyer, but I'm thankful for each and every one of you that have been fighting this fight in the courts. And certainly, we just saw the news on SB4, which we saw last session, which made it a felony to just simply trespass, across borders, and would have led to a lot more folks being incarcerated at the cost of Texas taxpayers. And that's something that we've been able to talk about forever, or at least during this session, that's not something that we're in favor of. Look, TCRP spent a lot of time in my office this year. We joke in here that we should have just set up a cot for a lot of folks, or increase the size of this office because it felt like people were living in here. But we appreciate the fact that you work for all Texans, including my own constituents, and through your advocacy and making sure that we're successful to protect all the rights of our citizens, including those that are undocumented. And y'all know, and I was very vocal this year that I've lived my entire life in the immigrant community, and it's not something that I'm going to run away from. These are human rights, and they're being violated day in and day out, and the people are being undervalued for what they do every day to make sure that this is the fastest growing state, and especially Latino business owners, which that's something I'm very proud to be one, and defender of everybody's right to start their own business. So look, I want to just say again, thank you for making us look good at TCRP. What y'all do is critical, and it's necessary that you continue the fight and keep fighting and keep growing and bringing people to Austin to make sure that we have success. And this job is not done alone. And so I thank you, Chris, and Rochelle, and everybody on this call, for your passion and your energy to make sure that we have what we need. Now, I've been asked to make an introduction here, someone that I got to know during the session, and I really do thank you and all that are on the call, because you're going to be hearing from some experts who organized for these key issues that we fought. They will discuss the key wins that we had during this legislative session, and maybe discuss some of the losses and game plan for what we're going to do in upcoming sessions. So again, thank you for allowing me to be on with y'all. I'm going to listen in, and I love you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for the work that you're doing. So without further ado, I want to pass off the mic to my man Danny Woodard, policy attorney for Beyond Borders.
Thank, thank you, Representative. It's so great to have that introduction, and thanks for all of your work this session. Working with you and your staff was like one of the great honors that we had this session, to work with such a smart, capable team that really got the job done in so many different ways. So, just want to say thank you to you for that. Before so my name is Danny Woodward. I'm a policy attorney with the Texas Civil Rights Project, and I work on the Beyond Borders program, which means that I focus on issues that deal with immigration at the state and federal level, and that also impact border communities across Texas and immigrant communities within our state. And before we really get into some of the wins and losses and what happened this session, I just want to set the table and talk about where we were at the start of session, because the political landscape and the policy landscape was a lot different than it is now. And so it was a lot different than it was even kind of at the end of session in April and May and June. So it's kind of just important to set the stage. So if you remember, in summer and fall of 2024, the we were kind of in the middle of a hot election season, and the Trump campaign was really focusing on immigration as an issue that they were trying to hit the Biden administration for, and talk about the Biden open border policy and all of that stuff that they were going on about. I think we at TCRP would strongly push back on the fact of a Biden open border policy. In fact, we sued the Biden administration repeatedly because we think they were violating federal law, but we can talk about that at a different point in time. But the point is that immigration was this kind of really hot button issue that was going on. And in fact, the state of Texas had spent billions, somewhere around $11 billion over the previous 4 years, from 2021 to 2024, doing a state border policy called Operation Lone Star, where they sent tens of thousands of personnel from the Department of Public Safety and from the Texas Military Department, the Texas National Guard, down to the border to patrol the border, to set up and militarize our border communities, and to just stop and arrest people. And this led to a bunch of different abuses down there, including racial profiling, the arrest and beating of people who are just trying to cross the border and get safety here in the United States. And then also the huge influx of military type personnel into our border communities. I put this picture up here. That's a park in Eagle Pass. You probably all have heard of Shelby Park. And this is on a golf course. So this is where the people of Eagle Pass used to play golf. And the Department of Public Safety threw up a bunch of concertina wire there and turned it into essentially a military zone. And so the state, for the years before this session started, was really treating our border communities like an occupied military area, much more so than a valuable part of Texas. And so going into session, we were in the middle of that hot election season, and I don't think anybody knew who was going to win. And I think a lot of people actually thought that Trump would lose. And so a lot of the legislators going into session were operating under that assumption and operating under the assumption that their continued political message through session would be that they need to hit I guess the Harris administration on immigration. So when the pre-filing happened in the fall, I think that was in October, they filed a whole bunch of bills that had to do with immigration. And I'll talk about the themes in a second. But I think one thing that we saw throughout session is that at the start of session, they were really focused on these immigration bills. And then as the Trump administration took power, it took a much more kind of aggressive line and messaging about immigration. It felt to me, and this is my personal opinion, that folks kind of de-emphasize these immigration bills in a lot of ways, with a few notable exceptions. So just going into session, we were really geared up for immigration to be a super important topic, and it continued to be. But I think over session, it just kind of moved to the back burner a little bit. So that's kind of just a big picture thing I wanted to share with y'all. In all of the bills that were pre-filed, I kind of identified three main themes, and there were a few other things that happened. But the first is that there were a number of attempts to impose state criminal consequences for alleged federal immigration violations. And all of these bills are problematic for two reasons. The first is that immigration by law and under our Constitution in the Supremacy Clause is a matter that is left solely to the prerogative of the federal government. The federal government regulates immigration. States are not allowed to do so. So when they are trying to impose state criminal consequences for violating federal immigration law, that's just unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has said that. And as Representative Romero referenced last week, we just had a court decision from the Fifth Circuit reaffirming that once again. It's also problematic because most immigration violations are civil violations. And so when a person violates civil law, they are not supposed to get criminal consequences. So it's really problematic that the state would be looking to lock people up or impose further criminal consequences on people when they have violated something that is a federal civil law. The next bucket that we saw was once the Trump administration was firmly in power, we saw much more appetite for increased cooperation with the federal immigration authorities and decreased funding for the program I talked about called Operation Lone Star. One of the quiet and maybe more important things that happened this session was when the budget was first announced towards the beginning of session, they were allocating 6 point something billion for Operation Lone Star over the biennium for the next 2 years. And then very quietly at the end of session, it was announced that they were going to cut that in half. And that number is now $3 billion. And while what's happening at the federal level is very problematic, I think that this is actually a really good thing that happened because this is going to cut in half the amount of damage that the state is going to be doing to our border communities and to immigrants under Operation Lone Star. And then the third bucket of bills that we saw were just a number of different attempts to limit immigrant access to community resources through healthcare and education in particular, which I'll get more into in a moment. So I'm going to start by talking about the bills that died. And in some ways, this is a celebration, and I think we want celebrate the wins where we can get them, even if we can't in this context pass very many positive bills, we can at least celebrate the really bad bills that didn't make it. So one of the big things that the governor identified as a priority and that state leadership was in general focused on was what they called bail reform. And my colleague Kirsten's going to talk about more about some of those bills. But one of those priorities was a constitutional amendment called SJR1, which would have automatically denied bail to anybody who is deemed an illegal alien in charge of certain felony offenses. This is a really problematic proposal because, first of all, it is unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment to deny bail automatically to people without individual determination about whether they're a flight risk or pose a risk to the community. So creating a bucket of illegal aliens and then saying all of those people don't get bail without looking at their individual circumstances is unconstitutional. And if this had passed, it would have been challenged in court and maybe gone up to the Supreme Court, and it could have, posed a great risk to bail law and precedent all across the country. So it's really important that this did not get through. It's also problematic because, and we saw this time and again, the definition of a legal alien that they were trying to use in this bill did not map cleanly onto federal immigration law. And in the original proposal, I think would have swept up people who are even permanent residents or in some cases citizens. And then as it got down, they kind of narrowed it a little bit, but still would have included people who have lawful status or presence in the United States, including people with DACA or Dreamers. And that just goes to a point, which is that states cannot regulate immigration, and also that whenever they try to do so, federal immigration law is really, really complicated, and there's just no good way to define who is illegal or not illegal. I won't get more into that, but I could talk for hours. And in fact, I did during session about that. So this bill required 100 votes because it was a constitutional amendment. And fortunately, so that would have required 12 Democrats to vote for it. And the Democrats held strong on this. And Rep. Romero was a great leader on this issue. And it did not get through despite an enormous amount of pressure being applied on folks. Everybody held strong, and this bill did not pass. SB 552 was very similar to SJR1, and that would have restricted the eligibility of community supervision for people defined as illegal aliens. This bill was a little bit funny because it actually made it off the calendar and to the floor, but then the author of the bill kept postponing it every day for I don't know how many days, but it felt like a month. And then on the very last day of session, he got up, and brought it to the floor. And there was an immediate point of order, which killed the bill, which was great to see. So we were happy about that. And here are some of the other bills that died. SB 659 was a bill that would have increased penalties for the offense of smuggling of persons. And this is important because current Texas law is already really bad in that it creates a 10-year mandatory minimum for people who are charged or convicted of smuggling of persons. And what's happening is that cartels are recruiting people online from across Texas, usually US citizens, usually young people, 18-year-olds, to come down, and they say, hey, come down to the border, make $1,000 by driving some people from point A to point B. And then if they get arrested, they'll get charged with something that would put them in jail for 10 years for making one poor choice. I won't get too much more into this bill, but it died, and it would have expanded that. HB 298 and SB 964 were two of a series of bills that were filed, and SB 964 went the furthest, or got the furthest through the process, that would have required putting an indicator of immigration or citizen status on people's driver's licenses. We were very concerned, especially in this environment, that this would allow and lead to discrimination against people and maybe even attacks. If you can imagine, for discrimination, people might need to show their driver's licenses when they're trying to rent a house. And if it said non-citizen on it or something like that, that could lead to discrimination. And people also weren't able to point to any good reason to do this because non-citizens are eligible for many, many state benefits. And the main reason that was furthered was actually to stop non-citizen voting. But as my colleague Veronica will talk about, non-citizen voting is a vanishingly rare phenomenon that is not a real problem in the state of Texas. And adding citizenship status to driver's licenses would do nothing to solve it. HB 2587 was a codification of Governor Abbott's rule or executive order that requires Texas hospitals to ask people about immigration status when they go to the hospital. We've already seen this has been in place since last year, and we've already seen that it harms immigrant communities by stopping people from going to the hospital when they need care because they're afraid to disclose their immigration status. And this bill would have codified it, which would make it harder to repeal. Um, this also died on a point of order, which is very satisfying, and we're happy to see it go. And then finally, HB 232 and SB 1798 would have repealed the Texas Dream Act, which allows in-state tuition for undocumented people here in Texas. These both, there were a number of bills that tried to do this. These both got to hearings and were very strongly opposed by the community and did not make it through past out of their respective uh, committees. Unfortunately, 2 days after session ended, the federal government filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas, charging that the DREAM Act was unconstitutional. And Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton did not defend his own state's law and apparently colluded with the federal government to admit or to claim that the Texas Dream Act is unconstitutional, and a court enjoined it. TCRP has now participated and joined and led a lawsuit trying to fight that, and we're working on that right now.
Hey,
I
Danny,
now want to talk a little bit. I don't have too much time left, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the bad bills that made it through. So one of the main priority bills we had this session was SB 8, which requires sheriffs to enter into immigration enforcement agreements called 287G agreements with ICE. And this is really problematic because it essentially turns our local police officers into ICE agents and decreases community trust with law enforcement. Folks are not going to call the police, even if they're a victim of a crime, if they think it might lead to a family member getting deported. And what I want to emphasize is that the version of this bill that came out of the Senate was really bad. And it went to the House, and Rep. Romero was actually a leader on this. And while we all recognize that mandatory 287G bills like this are super problematic, he worked very, very closely with folks on the other side of the aisle to make this the best possible 287G bill, the least harmful for our communities. And we got it to a really good place. And when it got voted out, it went to conference, and the Senate or the Republicans wound up going to Donald Trump, and he tweeted or he posted on social media that the House needs to accept the Senate version. And when that happened, they lost all political will for the House to stand up for the good version of the bill that I think a lot of Republican members of the House actually agreed with as well. And the version of the bill that got through, because of that, that got through in committee is bad and is really problematic. And now almost all sheriffs in Texas are going to be required to enter into some form of immigration enforcement agreements with ICE. And there's a question that are sheriffs required to comply, or is this a choice? They are required to comply. Currently, they can choose what level of immigration enforcement that they enter into. So I think most are just going to be doing immigration enforcement in their jails. But this bill does incentivize them doing much more than that as well. And that was one of the things that the House bill did, was really incentivize them to just limit it to immigration enforcement within jails and keep it off of the streets.
can I add in real quick, Danny?
Please,
Yeah, so
absolutely.
just so you know, the fight on SB8 was really difficult, and thank you for explaining it the way you did. We did try to limit it just simply to the warrant service model, which is the least of the three, and also limited the amount of money each county would get. The original bill was very expansive in that it could grow, and as long as you documented the cost that you incurred as a county, then it was open-ended, and it could have grown to many, many millions of dollars. So even after Trump tweeted, and you're right, one call does it all, apparently is what happens in this house now when Daddy Trump calls. But one of the things that was in the original bill was the language that said as offered, and we were able to keep that language off. So the previous bill, the Senate version, would have had an opportunity for the Trump administration to say every border county, we want you to do task force model, which would have meant that their law enforcement officers would have been compelled to comply and support immigration ICBP officers, and that we were actually able to keep off. So I hope that in the end, I mean, this was a horrible pill to swallow for me and for all of us that have been fighting against this. Um, but yeah, I mean, Trump's power right now just really shows the weakness, the weak knees of the Republicans here. That really they had enough. And Shortner certainly was not supportive of anything that the House did, despite Sheriff Louderback. And I mean, if there's any person to give credit to on the Republican side when we were in the back hall, Sheriff Louderback said, "This is a license to cheat and steal from the state of Texas and lie about the amount of money you're spending." I mean, I don't give credit to Republicans very often, but I will tell you, he fought really hard at my side to make sure that we really made this bill less than it was. I don't really have any answers for what's going to eventually happen with senators, but I just want to say thank you for all the work that you did there. Appreciate that. Wanted to clarify that that language was removed. And I felt like that was the biggest thing, the biggest success that we had within that language of that bill.
Yeah, thank you for flagging that. That was actually a particular hobby horse of mine. I think I went to every single office highlighting the as offered language that Rep. Romero was referring to and trying to get folks to understand that. And I was so happy when you and Sheriff Louderback actually like understood that and really grabbed onto it and took it to where it is. That was a really important thing that happened during session. Um, so yeah, I really appreciate all the great work on that. The other bills, just quickly, because we have a lot of other stuff to get through. SB 17 prohibits people who are domiciled in certain countries identified by the federal government as threats to national security. Currently, that is Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. But the motivation for this is really kind of I think it's an anti-Chinese government, anti-Chinese politics that's going through certain parts of the Republican or the right now, and it prohibits people who are domiciled in those countries from buying land in Texas. This is really problematic, and it passed. It's problematic because it's racist, of course. It's discriminatory, and it's going to lead to people who are from those countries or even perceived to be from those countries having a harder time buying land or even paying a higher price for land because people won't want to enter into transactions with them out of fear that this bill might impact those transactions. I'll also say that the bill is also stupid because if you were a sophisticated foreign intelligence network and you were trying to do something to harm the United States, I don't think you would pick somebody who is domiciled in your country to buy the land. I think you would use a front. But that's just my personal opinion. This bill is awful, and I believe some people are going to be challenging it in court. And I really hope that it does not get through. And then finally, HB 2017 also passed. This is just an expansion of SB4, which referenced before, that was passed in 2023, which created its own state immigration law, basically saying if you're found to illegally enter Texas or illegally re-enter Texas, you've committed a crime. That law is currently enjoined thanks to a lawsuit that we are working on very diligently and we got a great decision on. So this law, HB 2017, is not going to go any further for the moment because the underlying law is enjoined. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Kirsten, who's going to talk some about the criminal legal program.
Thank you, Danny. So I'm the policy attorney with the criminal legal program, and a large part of our job this session was trying to mitigate harm where we could and kill as many bills as we could. The top line theme was that everything was being criminalized, every aspect of Texans' lives were being criminalized, including reproductive care, voting, immigration, and the list goes on. There were also a record number of criminal enhancement bills that were filed, not only for adults, but for children as well. There were bills that would have weakened procedural protections for those who are accused of an offense. And then there were attempts, some successful attempts and a lot of failed attempts that would have weakened already weak tools that hold law enforcement officers accountable when they harm Texans. Next slide, please. So let's start by getting into the bills that we were able to successfully defeat. So starting with HB 2486/SB 781, this bill would have allowed law enforcement agencies to keep all records related to an officer's conduct a secret if, through an internal investigation by that agency, there was insufficient evidence or not enough evidence to sustain a charge of misconduct. So this effectively would have created a permanent black box for law enforcement conduct records. Those records would not have been seen by the public at any time. Only law enforcement agencies would have been able to access those records. And it would have incentivized law enforcement agencies to not discipline officers because if they did find that an officer's conduct rose to the level of misconduct and sustain that charge, it could have led to that officer's conduct embarrassing the agency. The next bill is SB3, which I know a lot of folks on this call has heard a lot about in the news. SB3 would have imposed criminal penalties for the manufacture, sale, or possession of certain cannabinoids that are currently legal under Texas law. This would have been an extension of what we know is the failed war on drug type of policies that we've seen for decades. We've seen how criminalizing cannabis and its derivatives has devastated communities and disproportionately impacted people of color, Black and Brown communities, particularly, and burden our courts and prisons with people who pose no risk to public safety. This bill actually did pass both chambers, um, but it was vetoed by Governor Abbott at the very, very last minute. He called for the legislature to focus on regulating these products rather than outright banning and criminalizing them. You can go to the next slide. Couple of other bills that died, SB 1727 and HB 3360. This would have made it easier to transfer children who are in the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. This is where kids are held if they are convicted of offenses. It's basically where a kid prison is what it is. And it would have made it easier for those children to be transferred to the adult prison system, which is the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And it also would have doubled down on the criminalization of youth in general. And I want to add a little additional context here. So we actually represent the mother of Joshua Beasley, who was a teenage boy who had died by suicide after being transferred from one of those kid prisons to an adult prison. And we know that many more children would have died if this bill would have passed, to be frank. The next part of the bills that died, and this is the last bill that I'm going to talk about that did not pass, but the next part of this presentation is going to focus on a bail package. These are the bail bills. So SJR 87 was one of the two constitutional amendments that we successfully killed. The other was SJR 1, which Danny talked about. Um, this was actually not a part of the original bail package that was introduced at the beginning of session. It was rushed through the legislative process the last 2 weeks of session after the proponents and the author of the other bills realized that SJR 1 was extremely and widely unpopular among Texans and lawmakers, and that they weren't going to get the 100 votes to pass SJR 1. So because this was introduced towards the end of session and at the end of the deadline, we really didn't have the opportunity to negotiate any changes. And instead, we focused on the fact that this bill did not have any of the procedural protections that House members had worked so hard for and worked for months from like February all the way to the end of section. They had worked to get into SJR 5, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. But at this point in time, when SJR 87 had made it to the House floor, SJR 5 had already passed. So if you can go to the next slide. Talking a little bit more about the bail package. So zooming out a little bit, during the State of the State address, Governor Abbott named bail reform as an emergency item, and he claimed that it was necessary to promote public safety. But the bail package that was introduced at the beginning of session would not have promoted public safety. And in fact, it would have undermined public safety in a major way by chipping away at our fundamental right to due process and the presumption of innocence. So starting with SB 9 it did a lot of things, but I really want to focus on three things that it did. It expands the mandatory cash bail system. It allows prosecutors to appeal certain bail orders, and it limits when magistrates can set bail. Sorry, I'm dealing with some allergies, so excuse my voice. So the biggest thing that SB 9 does is that it largely expands the mandatory cash bail system. And the cash bail system requires people to pay their way out of jail. Or if they don't pay their way, they will languish in jail until they plead out or go to trial. So just for context, in a majority of cases, judges do have the discretion to require that a person pay to get their way out of jail, or they can release that person without that monetary requirement, but they can also impose other restrictions like a curfew order, GPS monitoring, or if a person is charged with like a DUI, then they can require that that person do regular breathalyzer tests. But this bill, SB 9, ties the hands of judges by requiring cash bail for certain offenses, including some misdemeanors, even if a judge thinks that based on the circumstances, cash bail is not appropriate in that situation. So, some of the things that we were able to get into, some of the amendments we were able to get into this. The first is one of the offenses that falls under that mandatory cash bail provision is terroristic threat. And so a terroristic threat is when you threaten to commit any offense of violence with the intent of putting a person at fear of bodily injury. So it could be me saying, I'm going to kill you. That is a terroristic threat charge. I could technically be charged with terroristic threat, put in pretrial detention, and required to pay a cash bail amount before I am released, or otherwise sit there until I plead out or go to trial. Um, and so the type of folks that we see who are charged with terroristic threat are people who are experiencing a mental health crisis. But it could also be two 17-year-olds in high school who are yelling at each other in the hallway, I'm going to kill you or I'm going to harm you. That's also, excuse me, the group of folks who could be tied up under this. So we were able to get this limited to terroristic threat charges that are charged as a Class A misdemeanor or higher. This means that people who are charged with Class B misdemeanor could technically be eligible for a personal bond and not required to pay a cash bond, meaning that a judge could release them without requiring them to pay cash to get out. The second part of this bill allows a prosecutor to appeal certain bail orders when they believe that the amount is not high enough. This completely tramples over judicial discretion, and it gives prosecutors just way too much unilateral power to challenge a judge's bail decision. So one of the changes we were able to get in this is requiring that the appellate judge who is going to hear these bail appeals issue an order no later than 20 days after the appeal is filed. So that is a huge win because that means people who would have been sitting, we talked to prosecutors who said these type of appeals could have taken up to 9 months. That means a person whose case, who a judge has said is eligible for a cash bond, but a prosecutor said, we don't think the amount is high enough, we're going to appeal this order. That person could have technically been sitting in jail for 9 months. Now, a person could be sitting in jail for only up to 20 days because that appeal process is expedited with this amendment that we were able to get in. So I want to move on to SGR 5 because I know we don't have a lot of time. So unlike a bill, a joint resolution needs at least 100 lawmakers to vote in favor of it. And it must be voted on by Texans during the election following the session. So although SJR 5 has technically passed um, out of the legislature, we as Texans who will be voting during the November election will be voting on whether we want this as part of our constitution or not. So, under our current state constitution, there are very limited exceptions where a person can be denied bail and pretrial freedom altogether. So, think of people who are charged with capital murder. A judge can say, you are not eligible for bail at all, meaning there is no cash bail, there's no personal bond. You will sit in jail until you either plead guilty or you go to trial. So, what this constitutional amendment does is it expands the circumstances in which a judge can deny a person pretrial freedom or bail. Now, we worked tirelessly with lawmakers to get very specific changes into this bill. So, when this bill was introduced, there was not a right to have counsel at these hearings. In a large majority of cases, in a large majority of counties, when you go in front of a judge and that judge determines your bail amount and whether there's probable cause to hold you in pretrial detention, you do not have a public defender, you do not have a private attorney there, you do not have legal representation there. So it is you who is being accused, there is the prosecutor there, and then there is the judge. And these hearings last no longer than like a minute. So imagine you are being accused of a very serious offense, even in cases where people who were accused who maybe didn't commit the offense, you do not have legal representation. So this is a huge win to say that if you are swept up under SGR 5, if there is a case where if you are charged with one of the offenses that fall under SGR 5, then you will have a right to counsel at these hearings where bail may be denied. We have talked to national partners who said Texas is the only state where in its constitution it will say, if this passes in November, where it will say a person has the right to counsel under these circumstances. So that was a huge win. And shout out to the coalition, all the lawmakers who worked on this. The other two changes we were able to get in there was a really long laundry list of offenses that would have been eligible under SJR 5, but we were able to limit it to the most serious and violent offenses. And then the last change deals with like a very technical thing where there was a preponderance of evidence standard. We were able to heighten that to a clear and convincing evidence standard, which is a higher bar that a judge has to meet when assessing whether this person is a threat to public safety. Mhm. All right, I almost done, y'all. Sorry. Some of the other bills that passed, starting with, we talked about in the themes, there was an attempt to weaken already weak tools that hold law enforcement officials accountable when they harm Texans. So this first one, SB 1637, the intent of the bill was to exempt on-duty officers that shoot a firearm at or in the direction of one or more people from being criminally charged with deadly conduct. But the amendment that we were able to get in there makes it to where that intent failed. So officers will still be able to be charged with deadly conduct when they use their firearm and shoot in the direction of civilians. But what this amendment says is that so under the deadly conduct statute, there is a presumption that of recklessness. Recklessness is presumed if you point your firearm or in the direction of another. This says that if an officer is pointing their firearm in the direction of another, they can be charged with deadly conduct, but that presumption is not there. So the prosecutor will have to prove that they intended to be reckless when they pointed that firearm. This effectively guts the bill and does not give the intent that it was meant to have. So there was a win there on SB 1637. The next bill is kind of an L. So SB 2570, this basically exempts an on-duty officer and jail guards from all criminal charges for using less lethal weapons. So when we think about less lethal, we think of tasers, tear gas, batons, etc., with big implications for protesters and people in jail. And then HB 6 is another bill that passed. This expands the reasons that children under third grade can receive out of school suspension, included repeatedly disrupting class, and it also creates disciplinary alternative education programs. You might know this as DAEPs. So I kind of want to back up and say that this bill was painted as one that would ultimately protect teachers and classroom environments by making it easier to remove disruptive students from the classroom. But we at TCRP believe that disruption is usually the symptom of a bigger issue. Maybe that kid is hungry. Maybe that kid didn't get any sleep last night. And we know that isolating this kid from the classroom, removing them from the classroom, doesn't really get down to the root cause of that misbehavior. If anything, children don't need to be isolated for their misbehavior. But when they are misbehaving, they need more individualized attention and resources, not isolation, not less resources. But through negotiations, there were several mitigating changes made, including ensuring that children who are placed in these virtual DAEP programs have suitable equipment, reliable internet access for virtual instructions, and that those children are provided in-person or telehealth behavioral support services. There were also guardrails put around when a child can be suspended or placed in these DAEP programs. Next slide, please. So what's next? So you probably heard about the special session. Greg Abbott has officially announced a special session, which starts at the end of this month in a couple of weeks. He has confirmed that SB3 will be on the list of bills that the lawmakers have to kind of reconsider and think about. Want to highlight that in his proclamation, his veto proclamation, the reason why he vetoed SB3. We agree with this. And he says that the bill will turn farmers, business owners, and consumers into criminals despite the protections for hemp products conferred by federal law. So Abbott's proclamation pushes for a bill that regulates THC rather than outright banning it or criminalizing the people who use it. So we'll be working with organizers, lawmakers, advocates, and people on the ground to ensure that any version of this bill does not criminalize the folks who possess um, THC related products and are not criminalized for it. And I'll go ahead and pass it to my colleague Veronica, who is a staff attorney with the voting rights team.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to recap what's been going on with voting rights during the legislative session. So some themes that we saw both during the pre-filed bills and things that we saw sort of advance through the process is unfortunately a continuation of increasing barriers to voting at every stage of the process. Luckily, the vast majority of these bills were either defeated or mitigated through the work of advocates and TCRP and lawmakers who are invested in making sure that people actually have access to the ballot box, but I'll go through what that looks like. We also saw an unfortunate expansion or an attempted expansion of state power over elections at the expense of local community participation and priorities. And I'll go into what that looks like with the bills that ended up passing or that were ultimately defeated. But regardless, we saw that theme going out through the process, and we've seen that theme over the past 5 years in particular. So the last theme that I'll talk about is just increased election criminalization, both for voters and election officials, which is really unfortunate and makes it scarier to vote in Texas. Next slide, please. All right, so the big bills that died. The big bad of this session in the voting rights space was unquestionably SB 16 / its companion HB 5337. Now, this bill would have required documentary proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. What does that mean? Essentially, it means that in order to actually register to vote and become an eligible voter in Texas, you have to submit to your county registrar paperwork that confirms your United States citizenship. For the vast majority of Texans who are who have citizenship through being born here, the only forms of documentation that you could provide would be a US passport or a birth certificate, which through data with our partners like Vote Writers, we have been able to demonstrate that 1.3 million Texans don't even have access to the citizenship paperwork at all. And part of the real issue with this system is that one, non-citizen voting is vanishingly rare. There was something like 67 identified potential non-citizen voter registrations identified by the Secretary of State in 2024, which when you compare that with the millions of registered voters in Texas is just a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of folks. And those are just registrations, not confirmed votes. This also would have created a two-tiered system of voter registration that enfranchises thousands of folks just for trying to access the ballot box. How does that work? So essentially, if you provide this documentation to your county, then your vote would count for all of the races on the ballot. If you didn't have this documentation for any reason, but the state couldn't verify independently that you were a non-citizen, then they would put you on a list to receive a limited federal ballot. And what that means is that on the back end, the only votes that would count for people on those lists would be your selections for US Congress. Why not the president? Very good question. So the theory behind this is that because when you're voting for president, you are only voting for the state electors, that it is not a federal race, and therefore your vote for president wouldn't be counted either. It is, I think, a very disingenuous legal theory, and we're very, very glad that this system did not make it through the process. This bill actually died in calendars thanks to a ton of work from advocates and community members showing up at the hearing. I think that there was a lot of pressure on folks to actually look at the implications of how this would affect their constituents, since a lot of rural voters actually would be very, very directly impacted and would have their registrations canceled under this system. It would also target naturalized citizens, right? Which is something that we are deeply concerned about at TCRP, that we do not want a system that unfairly may target people who recently got their citizenship, because there could be a record somewhere in the state system that they applied for a driver's license at one point in time. And at that time, they were a non-citizen, right? And because of that, being unfairly targeted with this retroactive truing up of trying to figure out who is a citizen and who isn't. Part of that whole fight was, as Danny mentioned earlier, this push to label IDs, essentially. And I think the most egregious example of these types of bills was SB 964. The original version of the bill would have had driver's licenses for folks who are not US citizens to have a different orientation and to have in capital letters, not a non-citizen. That was later revised to not eligible to vote, which is slightly less egregious, but still deeply problematic. This was another bill that died in calendars, thanks to people speaking up. But the reason that I input it with our voting rights bills is because the main reason and one of the big pushes for this bill was essentially that they were saying that, oh, this won't impact people because we're going to pass this driver's license bill that will make it so that your citizenship is obvious on your driver's license. But that has all of the racial profiling and discrimination implications that Danny went over earlier. So very, very happy that this didn't make it through. And that's how we are there. Third, we have SB 505, and this gets into kind of the nitty gritty of election administration. And this bill would have allowed essentially candidates and PACs to request explanations regarding any election irregularity on a race that they were part of from the county. If the candidate or PAC was not satisfied with that process after going through asking that for that explanation a few times, they could just go directly to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State would look at the information. If they didn't think that the explanation that the county provided was sufficient, then they could compel an audit at the county's expense of that election. And further, they could put that county under administrative oversight. What does that mean? That essentially means that the Secretary of State, under its own authority, with no other evidence other than a candidate's grievance and not being happy with the county's explanation of what happened, could just take over a county elections department. And this would be applicable for any county in the state. Currently, only Harris County is subject to potential administrative oversight. It hasn't actually been placed under oversight as of now, but the fact that these counties are being treated differently and that the state is making these moves to put in this backstop to be able to take over local elections offices is deeply concerning. This bill died at the 11th hour. It was pretty much one of the very last bills on the very last day that you could hear a Senate bill for the first time on the House floor, and died on a point of order. So very, very glad that that bit the dust as well. Next slide, please. Okay. Regarding the criminalization of election offenses and expansion of state power, one of the big bills that folks over in the Senate in particular were trying to advance were SB 1026 and HB 5138. Now, these bills in their original form would have allowed the Attorney General to prosecute election offenses if the local DA had not taken any action on a reported election offense within 6 months. So that would basically mean that a local DA would have no prosecutorial discretion over election offenses that were committed in their jurisdiction, because they couldn't control whether any reported election offense was eventually prosecuted. That would also mean that prosecution would be compelled even if there was no real evidence that the alleged offense had even happened, right? So this bill was initially stalled out in the Senate and then made a bit of a speed run through the House. And the House actually adopted a few changes that were helpful, including broadening what counted as a prosecutorial action so that local prosecutors could, investigate any potential offenses and then make the decision to essentially deprive folks of jurisdiction. At the very last minute, the Senate decided, hey, we're going to throw all of that out the window, including the 6-month period where local DAs have some jurisdiction to investigate things in their own jurisdiction. And we are going to just make this an AG must prosecute election offenses bill. That did not fly with the House, and this bill died in conference committee because the two sides could not agree. Very happy about that dying. Last bill that died that was bad was HB 1091. I think that this is one of the most insidious bad ones. And it just shortens the timeline for voting by mail from the application deadline. For the application deadline, moving it 5 days earlier, and the deadline for actually putting your ballot in. So that also died on a point of order at the last minute. And we are very glad that that happened. Next. Okay, speed run through our last few things that did become law. SB 2753 was initially a completely different bill that got changed into a bill that would just create a different voting period. So instead of early voting starting 15 days before election day and then having that weekend/Monday off that before election day, it would just be a continuous voting period starting 12 days before election day up and through election day. And that will not be implemented according to the terms of the bill, which is pretty unusual, until every county has told the Secretary of State that they can implement that change. But it can happen no later than August 1st, 2027. So that's actually good since it would give us multiple weekends in order for voters to vote, which is great since not all folks get time off to vote during early voting. HB 521 is problematic. It's a bill that would require curbside voters to swear an oath on penalty of perjury that they physically cannot enter the polling place that they are voting curbside from, or that they need to vote curbside as a reasonable accommodation. But one good amendment that we managed to get on there, though, is that it allows drivers of curbside voters to vote curbside as well. In addition, it was amended to get rid of the intent standard for being knowingly and putting that into intentionally. So you would have to intentionally not swear that oath on penalty of perjury. Last one on this one is SB 506. It basically allows the SOS to rewrite ballot propositions that it thinks are misleading. We got an amendment on there that added a pre-clearance process so that cities could preemptively submit ballot propositions to avoid needless contests later down the road. Next slide. SB 510 allows the Secretary of State to withhold voter registration funding from counties that don't timely schedule voter registration challenge hearings. We've had a huge influx of these voter registration challenges that some counties like Harris County have received thousands literally the day before the deadline. And the vast majority end up being baseless. I believe in Harris County, there was not a single one that was found to be valid. So this would basically allow the state government to hold hostage funding that counties need in order to actually schedule these hearings timely. So it's kind of counterproductive. We did manage to get a amendment on there that would give the that would add that the secretary has to give the county notice and a reasonable opportunity to respond to the violation. And it would also require SOS to make rules to actually implement that process. So made it a little bit better, but still unfortunate that that made it through to the finish line. Next thing. Okay, special session, possibilities nebulously out there. There's been some reporting that the federal government is interested in a congressional redistricting in Texas. Mid-decade redistricting is unusual, but not unprecedented in Texas. We have an unfortunate history of doing this. And there hasn't been any actual notice from state leaders that it is going to be on the agenda at this point. However, it has been rumored. There have been several articles about it, so I would definitely keep an eye out. And if you are interested in being involved in the legislature, please be prepared to give legislators community input about how potential maps would affect your community. That input is completely vital for it to be on the public record that legislators are redrawing maps in a way that doesn't serve voters. And finally, documentary proof of citizenship could always make a comeback. We haven't heard anything definite, but since it was a lieutenant governor priority, we want to make sure that we are being vigilant and on the lookout for potential additions. And I will turn it over to Kelly.
Hey, everyone. All right. So sorry, we're a little bit over time, but we're just about done. But really quickly, we need to shout out all of our amazing volunteers who did this work alongside us. So you just heard from the experts who were practically living at the Capitol all session long. But volunteers were just as crucial to this work that we're doing. So we had over 450 Texans join our Legislative Action Network, and we're ready to, at a moment's notice to take action at the Ledge and fight back against these harmful policies and support good ones. So there's some stats on the screen about how much our volunteers were able to accomplish over session. They took over 3,300 actions, and we're just so grateful. Public pressure is a crucial part of legislative advocacy, and we couldn't do this work without our volunteers. And I know there's a lot of y'all on the call right now, so thank you so much for being in this fight with us and following along all session long to fight back against these harmful proposals. And that being said, there is a special session coming up, so there might be more opportunities to take action, and we would love for y'all to join the fight with us. So here is a QR code you can scan, or we might put this link in the chat if you want to join our Legislative Action Network and take action with us during the special session. So thank you so much. All of this incredible work to fight for good policy for Texans is thanks to supporters like you. So thanks for keeping our lights on and for supporting the largest legislative program that TCRP has had. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jackie to see if we have any questions before we hop off.
I think we're going to wrap just in lieu of time, but if y'all have any questions, feel free to forward those to TCRP. We have contact on our website. And if you have any last minute questions here you want to get in, I'll stay on for a couple minutes to take those and we'll try to get back to you.